We continue our look at the book of Genesis, looking at how God created things, how they were meant to be, but then also assessing how they really are. And today we look at Genesis chapter 6, the beginning of this cataclysmic story of the flood. Not looking at the whole thing, but just the beginning of it, and looking to see what we might learn from God's frustration with the world, but also his resolve to redeem all things. Let me read Genesis chapter 6, beginning in verse 11. Now the earth was corrupt in God's sight, and the earth was filled with violence. And God saw the earth, and behold, it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted their way on the earth. And God said to Noah, I have determined to make an end of all flesh, for the earth is filled with violence through them. Behold, I will destroy them with the earth. Verse 17, for behold, I will bring a flood of waters upon the earth to destroy all flesh, in which is the breath of life under heaven. Everything that is on the earth shall die. But I will establish my covenant with you, and you shall come into the ark, your sons, your wife, and your sons' wives with you. You know, when I was a kid, I was terrified by this thing called the doomsday clock. Maybe you've heard of it. It was created in 1947 by a group of nuclear scientists, some of whom were part of the Manhattan Project, and they created it to communicate the ongoing danger of living in the nuclear age. And they started the time on the clock with 7 minutes to midnight, midnight being the conceived of nuclear Armageddon. And so they started the clock with very little time left on it. Now, since then, they've moved the minute hand forward and backward, depending upon certain kinds of events. But it was really emphasized as a kid. As a kid of the 80s, I heard about it all of the time. And I have to tell you that it induced a lot of anxiety in me and people of my generation. You know, the end is near. And indeed, there have been moments when I wondered what comes next in history, if anything. Is this the end? Sometimes we wonder if humanity has just gone too far. Our corruption, our brutality has pushed God to the end of his patience. And if that's true, well, it wouldn't be the first time. And in Genesis 6, we learn something about the Lord, how he thinks about the wickedness that he sees on the earth. But we also learn about his resolve to put things right. We face points of inflection in history right now. We will face more of them in the future, and not just on the grand scale of things, but in our own personal lives. And we'll ask ourselves the question: is this the end? And we can offer this answer. Helpful in some ways, but maybe not in others. Is it the end? Well, yes, for some things, but in other ways, no. The Lord is often bringing about an end to our own designs, bringing an end to the schemes of the leaders of this world, but he's always faithful to his purposes, his intent to redeem the world. Right after he says he will destroy the world, he also says this, verse 18, but I will establish my covenant with you, and you shall come into the ark, your sons and your wife and your sons' wives with you. Things will continue on. Now, God has a pretty radical approach to the current circumstance of wickedness, and at times radical approaches are necessary. I told you about the building or rebuilding of my deck. There's times when that rebuilds, you just have to admit, and you need to start over and everything needs to be torn down. There are times when the forest needs a good burning for the health of the forest, the long-term health of the forest. But that doesn't mean that we despair of the forest, of the project of the deck. And God doesn't despair of his intent to bless the world through his people. When the Lord says, I will establish my covenant with you, when he says that to Noah, the Lord is saying that this relationship, the relationship between God and the creation, God and humanity, that's been from the beginning, it's going to continue on. And oh yes, there are going to be endings of sorts, no doubt, but God's intent to redeem all things remains. And covenant representatives, whether it's Adam in the garden or Noah in this case, or Abraham and later Moses, those representatives may come and go, but God's purposes from the beginning endures. There's a much bigger picture than simply one generation. God's people may be beaten and battered. Institutions that he establishes, like the church, may falter, even fail tragically. We may feel abandoned by God. And that feeling isn't unknown to God's people. We certainly read about it in the scriptures. We see this wonderful honesty in the writers of the scriptures. Noah probably felt it. Job felt it. Many of the psalmists felt it. Jeremiah wrote in his one of his great works, Lamentations, about feeling abandoned by God. But the Lord remains faithful. He soldiers on with us, even through the floundering and the failure, even through the faltering of our own faith. While we are sometimes faithless, he remains faithful. If we lose our footing, we lose our grip, he doesn't lose his grip on us, on his purposes. He doesn't lose his grip on you. Our faith is weak and failing, but you got to remember, it's not about us. It's not about our strength, but his strength being manifest through us. This week, remember, it may seem like it's all coming apart, but God will remain faithful to you. Keep trusting in that. Blessings on you all.